I'd like to show you a picture that Robert and I found when he was going through my stuff and straightening out my house. This is a picture of the Lehigh class of 1945, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And here, with the overseas cap on, is my older brother, Frank Snyder. He had gone to Drexel and finished 2 years and had to leave because he was sick, so he finished up some years later in the class of 1945. I graduated from Lehigh in 1944. My cousin graduated in 1930, 1940, another cousin, and my uncle graduated in 1911. So all told, 9 of us have gone through Lehigh and graduated. And Lehigh University is an Ivy League school located in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Period.
Perfect.
Okay?
Let's see the other picture we found.
This one?
Uh-huh.
We also found this this political card. This was taken back in 1916 when my father, who was part owner of a lumber yard in the town we lived in, Minersville, PA, became very interested in politics and ran for the state legislature. And this is a card showing his picture, and it says, "For legislature, 4th District, vote for Frank Snyder of Minersville." He was a big man, about 250 pounds, and he taught me when I was a boy. He taught me how to swim. He taught me the love of being out in the woods. And unfortunately, because he lost so much money in the campaign, then through his Democratic connections, he was appointed postmaster of the town. And he actually had gone to Washington on the train and was up on the reviewing stand when they swore President Wilson into office. But after he took over the postmastership, he did that job in the daytime, and he did his work at the lumber company, estimating and calculating and so forth at night. And I guess it was too much of a chore to keep going, and he developed heart trouble, and he died in 1928 at the age of 48 years. At that time, I was 10 years old, and he is buried in the cemetery in Minersville, PA. One of my experiences during World War II involved a 600-mile march from western part of Austria and Germany across Austria to the eastern end next to Czechoslovakia. And the reason for this, we were supposed to meet up with the Russian army on the Danube River, which we did, and that was at Linz, L-I-N-Z, Linz, Austria. So, the reason for this was because the Germans had made a push and pushed their lines perilously close to the American lines. the so-called Bulge. And there in the Battle of the Bulge, I think it was the 27th Division was annihilated, and the Germans almost broke through. So the Russian army was come down from the north, and we were coming from the west to make a solid line so that we didn't trap the Germans, which we did. While I was there, at a certain point in time, I was sent up to take charge of the border between Czechoslovakia and Austria. And we had the little red and white sentry booth, red and white striped pole, and right next to it was a barracks building that the Germans had built when they had control of all that property. So that's where my men stayed. And I think I had probably 200 men, and our mission was to stop and examine the papers for anybody going into Austria, coming into Austria, or going into Czechoslovakia. Well, I got tired of my men being fed army rations, like dried potatoes, dried carrots, dried red beets. So, they used to give us in the army crackers that we called dog biscuits, but they were square like a Graham biscuit and tasted like cardboard. So I told my mess sergeant that I wanted fresh food for men. And when the war was going on, well, it was still going on, but Goring had forbidden anybody to go fishing in the Sudetenland, which is that part of Czechoslovakia that buttered up to Austria where the sentry station was. So my mess sergeant, who had been a restaurant owner up in Poughkeepsie, New York, I made him the mess sergeant immediately, and I told him to take these dog biscuits, as we called them, into the surrounding farmland and see if he could trade them for fresh eggs, fresh lettuce, fresh vegetables of any kind. And the farmers loved them. They thought they were cookies. So Krause, I'd give Krause my Jeep and driver and about 10 boxes of cookies, and he'd come back with all this fresh food. So my men, of course, were delighted with it. And then as far as the fish were concerned, we had been allowed to take prisoners of war to make the beds and clean up and everything, and we had 6. And I asked the colonel to allow me to keep them rather than go 20 miles down to get them and bring them out and then take them back. So he said, well, I'll okay it, but if any escape, it's your ass. And I said, they're not going to escape. Where else can you get food, shelter, clothing? American cigarette. So that they never were a problem. But among these was a fella who I think was from Hamburg, Germany originally, a German, and he was a fancy cook on Holland American lines. And so when I found that out, I immediately put him in the kitchen with my mess sergeant. And then I had some of my men out as a fishing party catching the trout, which abounded because nobody was allowed to catch them. And then nobody was allowed to go hunting. So we had at least 7 deer hanging up all the time. Because in Europe, deer aren't that big. They're a fallow deer, or red deer, And so after they had cured sometime, we'd have fresh meat instead of dried stuff, like Spam. I haven't eaten Spam since I left the Army. Because the Spam we got came in long loaf cans, square, from Argentina. And when we got it, in there there'd be gristle and bones. It was terrible stuff. They'd hack it off. They'd open a can. It was about that long and square in the end. So we'd do anything to have fresh food. So I was determined that my men would have it. And after I got it organized and we got it going, everybody was delighted. They loved it. Loved it. And then once a week, I'd send a truck into Czechoslovakia to Pilsner, where Pilsner beer originated. And I'd have a keg of beer on tap for the men. And then the next was about 20 miles more in another direction. I'd send them to Budvici, where Budweiser type beer was made. So the men loved to be there. And they did anything I wanted them to. I was about 18 miles from regimental headquarters, and nobody ever came out there. It was all up to me. So back at battalion headquarters, which was where the mental headquarters was also, they heard about me getting these prisoners of war and keeping them. And they thought, hey, that's a good idea. We'll get some for us too. So they got 6 of them, and they made them, scrub the mess hall, make the beds, do that type of work. So they had this Hungarian dressed up in a GI uniform, no bullets, doing guard duty, pacing back and forth, back and forth. Well, just out of the blue, they call him Howling something general, who had been demoted really to regimental status from being higher. He drove up in his Jeep. And this Hungarian kept pacing back and forth, back and forth. And this started to get madder than hell because he didn't stop and present arms, which you do when a superior officer comes. So he started yelling at this Hungarian. And the guys told me about it because they were in the mess hall watching it all. And finally it sunk into this Hungarian that he should stop and present arms through the jail. And still yelling at him, and he came up and stopped and presented arms, and he started yelling at this Hungarian everything. And the Hungarian said, "Not speak English," and that made the general furious. That ended the prisoners of war. No more. If we got him again, they had to be in dyed blue uniform with PW on the legs and on the back. But that ended it. One of the episodes that I remember. I'll tell you more later.